My parents secretly spent my college fund on my sister's car, then told me to drop out and take a year off because they couldn't afford my education. My younger sister, Emily, just recently managed to graduate high school. But let me tell you, it's been anything but a smooth ride for her. This wasn't her first or even her second attempt at finishing. She'd actually failed twice before, and this was her third shot. Emily's always struggled when it comes to academics. Even as a kid, school just didn't click for her. It felt like she was always trying to keep up with everyone else but could never quite get there. It wasn't just the grades, either. Emily had a tough time staying focused, and her motivation was practically non-existent most of the time. That combination really hit her hard. At first, she came up with excuses. She used to say she was dyslexic, and for a while, everyone believed her. But after running all kinds of tests, that theory was ruled out. Once she didn't have that excuse anymore, things took a turn. Instead of working harder, Emily started acting out. It seemed like every other week, she was getting into trouble. She'd get caught smoking weed with older kids at school or skipping class altogether. Sometimes, she'd sneak off to parties and leave the teachers scrambling to call my parents about her absences. My mom and dad were constantly stressed and didn't know what to do with her. They tried everything, talking to her, grounding her, but none of it seemed to stick. Emily had this knack for slipping out of the house, even when she was grounded. Sometimes it was late at night, and she'd meet up with her usual group of friends or even random guys she'd met online. During all this, my parents started directing their frustration at me instead of Emily. They'd say things like, "You're her older sister, it's your job to set an example and guide her." And, sure, I wanted to help her. I really did. But the truth was, Emily wasn't interested in listening to me. Anytime I tried to talk to her about making better choices, she'd snap back at me or shut me out completely. After a while, I gave up. The arguments weren't worth it, and it was exhausting trying to be the one responsible for her decisions when nothing I said or did seemed to make a difference. So, I decided to back off. Keeping the peace felt easier, even though I knew deep down it wasn't the right move. Then one morning, everything came to a head. It was early, and my mom, as usual, got up to check on me and Emily. But when she walked into Emily's room, she found it empty. Her screams woke me up, and I stumbled out of bed, barely awake, to see what was going on. My dad came running, too. Mom was in a full-blown panic, demanding to know where Emily was. I rushed to her room, hoping to find a note or some clue about where she'd gone, but there was nothing. We tried calling her, but her phone was off. That's when the panic really set in. We were minutes away from calling the police when one of Emily's friends reached out to me privately. What she told me made my stomach drop. Emily had gone out to meet some guy she'd met online. I felt this overwhelming mix of fear and anger as I passed the news along to my parents. Luckily, her friend had the guy's address because Emily had shared it with her earlier. Without wasting a second, we jumped in the car and drove straight to his place. My mom didn't hesitate for a moment. She barged right in, yelling Emily's name at the top of her lungs. When Emily finally came out, her face said it all, complete shock and embarrassment. She couldn't believe we'd actually tracked her down. Thankfully, nothing terrible had happened. The guy seemed just as stunned as we were. Apparently, Emily had lied to him about her age, pretending to be older than she was. My dad, furious, made sure the guy understood how much trouble he'd be in if anything had happened. Then he practically dragged Emily out of there. The car ride home was a nightmare, full of shouting, accusations, and Emily defending herself at every turn. My mom kept trying to make her see how dangerous her actions were, but Emily wasn't having any of it. To make matters worse, she was mad at me for getting involved. She said I should have kept my mouth shut and let her come home on her own. She just couldn't see how serious the situation was or how scared we'd all been for her safety. When we finally got back home, my mom grounded her again, and for a moment, I hoped this might be the wake-up call Emily needed. But, as usual, that hope didn't last long. After the whole ordeal with Emily running off to meet that stranger, my parents' entire approach to raising her did a complete 180. Instead of being strict and laying down some much-needed boundaries, they became almost smotheringly protective. The fear of losing her, or even the thought of her ending up in another risky situation, had them tiptoeing around her. It felt like their main goal was to keep her content and at home, no matter what. Emily caught on to this shift faster than I expected. She realized she had this incredible power over them, and boy, did she know how to use it. The more they worried about her rebelling or getting into trouble, the more she took advantage of their fear. It was like she figured out this unspoken rule: as long as she kept them scared, they'd cave to her every demand. When Emily failed high school for the first time, I thought, this has to be the moment. I was sure my parents would finally step up, give her a serious talking to, and maybe even enforce some consequences to get her back on track. But what happened instead? Nothing. They didn't scold her. They didn't ground her. They didn't even seem particularly upset. Instead, they told her they understood how tough high school could be and encouraged her to give it another try. It was like they were pretending it wasn't a big deal, even though it clearly was. I couldn't believe it. To me, it felt like they were sweeping everything under the rug, turning a blind eye to reality. Their version of support wasn't helping her at all, it was enabling her. Every time she messed up, they'd excuse it or find a way to justify her actions. It was as if they were rewarding her for bad behavior instead of teaching her what accountability looked like. The second time Emily repeated high school, things went downhill fast. She got caught cheating on one of her exams, which led to her getting suspended. I thought, okay, surely this will be the wake-up call my parents and Emily need. But even then, my parents didn't handle it the way I hoped. Instead of holding her accountable, they chalked it up to the stress of school being too much for her and practically brushed the cheating off as a symptom of her struggles. That's when Emily hit her breaking point. She felt defeated watching all her friends move on to college while she was still stuck in high school. Frustrated and over it, she decided to drop out entirely. She started working at a local bar, saying she just needed to make some money and figure things out on her own. My parents, desperate to steer her back toward a better path, tried everything to convince her to return to school. They even roped me into their efforts, urging me to talk to her and help her see reason. I didn't have much hope, honestly. Emily was stubborn, and I'd learned the hard way that reasoning with her wasn't easy. But deep down, I knew she couldn't spend her whole life working a dead-end job. So I gave it my best shot. After countless arguments and back-and-forth conversations, Emily finally agreed to give school one last try. My parents, determined to help her succeed, paid a hefty sum to enroll her in a different high school that was willing to overlook her past records. This time around, something shifted in Emily. She actually put in the effort, studying hard and staying on top of her assignments. Watching her finally take school seriously was a relief, and when she passed her exams, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride. To celebrate, I took her out for a fun night, just the two of us. When we got back to my parents' house, I was too wiped out to make the drive back to my apartment near campus. Instead, I decided to crash in my old bedroom for the night. The next morning, I woke up to the warm, inviting smell of cinnamon wafting through the house. My mom's cinnamon rolls were a family favorite, so I immediately knew she had baked them for us. Excited, I jumped out of bed and headed toward the kitchen. As I got closer, I could hear my parents talking in hushed tones. Their voices sounded serious, almost like they were discussing something they didn't want me to overhear. When I walked in, they both looked up, their expressions stiff and a little awkward. I asked what was going on, but my mom quickly waved it off, saying everything was fine. She tried to act casual, but I could tell something was bothering them. Then, she changed the subject, insisting that I stay the whole day and join them for dinner that evening. I hadn't planned on staying, I had a lot of work to catch up on, but she was so insistent that I gave in. One more day wouldn't hurt, right? That night at dinner, my dad raised his glass and told Emily and me how proud they were of both of us. My mom smiled and nodded, adding how much they appreciated everything we'd accomplished. Then they turned to Emily and asked if she'd started thinking about college. Emily's face lit up with excitement. She told them about the applications she'd sent out to several prestigious colleges, including some Ivy League schools. She said she wanted to attend a university like mine, one that was well respected and would set her up for a bright future. Seeing her so enthusiastic and optimistic was heartwarming, especially after everything she'd been through. My parents listened intently, their expressions filled with pride as she talked about her plans. But then, their attention shifted to me. The mood in the room changed, and for a moment, everything went quiet. Their faces grew more serious, and I could feel the weight of whatever they were about to say. My dad cleared his throat, his voice tinged with unease. He explained that with Emily preparing for college, they had been having some tough conversations about their finances. Then he dropped the bombshell: they couldn't afford to pay for my college tuition anymore. I just sat there, stunned. It felt like the ground had shifted beneath me. My mom chimed in, trying to soften the blow. She explained that they had always wanted to remodel the house but had put it off because they were focused on supporting me financially. Now, with Emily heading to college, they would have to dip into their savings even more, and they were worried about having enough for their retirement. She said it was only fair that I start paying for my own education since I was an adult now and they couldn't afford to support both of us anymore. My head was spinning. How was I supposed to cover my college expenses on my own? I barely had enough savings to get by for a few months, even with my part-time job. The idea of taking out student loans to finish my degree made my stomach churn. I had 2 more years to go before graduation, and now, out of nowhere, my parents were pulling the rug out from under me. I glanced at Emily, sitting across the table. She looked just as stunned as I was. She had just graduated after struggling so much, and while I was genuinely happy for her, the realization that my parents were going to keep supporting her while leaving me to fend for myself felt like a gut punch. I asked them, trying to keep my voice steady, "So, are you planning to support Emily for just 2 years of college like you did for me, or are you covering her entire education?" The room fell quiet. My parents avoided my gaze, and that silence gave me my answer. Finally, my mom spoke up, her tone gentle but frustratingly patronizing. "Emily's the youngest. She needs us right now. If we don't help her through all 4 years, she might feel overwhelmed and drop out of college altogether." My dad nodded in agreement, adding, "We're doing what we think is best for both of you." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "How is this fair?" I asked, my voice rising slightly. "I'm not asking you to fund my entire life, I just want you to stick to the commitment you made to me. You're paying for all of Emily's college, but you're leaving me stranded halfway through mine?" My dad's expression hardened. "Life isn't always fair," he said, his tone sharp. "If you can't afford the tuition, take a year off. Work some extra shifts, save up, and go back later. It's not the end of the world." The idea of delaying my graduation felt unbearable. I'd worked so hard to get this far, and now they were asking me to put everything on hold. I understood that money was tight, but it stung to see how easily they were willing to make sacrifices for me while going all in for Emily. After that dinner, I felt completely lost. Emily tried to comfort me, saying she was just as upset with our parents as I was, but I told her not to make things worse by arguing with them. The last thing I wanted was for her to lose her funding too and end up in the same position I was in. I couldn't let both of us go down this road. A few days later, Emily surprised me by suggesting I reach out to our grandparents. She reminded me that they had always been there for us growing up and might be able to help. It hadn't even crossed my mind to ask them, but as soon as she said it, I felt a glimmer of hope. Our maternal grandparents were well off and lived a couple of towns away. Growing up, Emily and I had spent countless weekends at their house, baking cookies with Grandma or helping Grandpa with his garden. I hadn't visited in a while, but they'd always been warm and welcoming. So, I took the bus to their house, feeling nervous but desperate. When I arrived, they were overjoyed to see me. Grandma pulled me into a tight hug, and Grandpa beamed, asking what had brought me over for a visit. Their warmth made me feel a little more at ease, but I couldn't ignore the knot in my stomach. I didn't want to dampen the mood, but I knew I couldn't delay the conversation for long. After catching up and sharing a meal together, I finally gathered the courage to explain why I had come. I told them everything: how my parents had decided to stop paying for my college, how I was now scrambling to figure out how to cover the costs, and how completely blindsided I felt. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could feel the emotion creeping in. They listened intently, their expressions growing more concerned with every word. When I finished, I took a deep breath and asked if they could loan me some money to help with my tuition. I promised them it would be just that, a loan. I assured them I would pay back every penny as soon as I could. Even as I said the words, I felt a wave of guilt. I hated asking for help, especially from people who had already done so much for me over the years. But I was running out of options. For a moment, they didn't say anything. Then Grandpa exchanged a puzzled glance with Grandma before turning back to me. "Why would you need money for college?" he asked, his brow furrowed. "What about the college fund we set up for you?" His words hit me like a ton of bricks. "What college fund?" I asked, completely confused. Grandpa leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. "Years ago, your grandmother and I set up 2 separate college funds, one for you and one for Emily. When you turned 18, we handed both funds over to your parents. We trusted them to use that money for your education." I just sat there, staring at him, trying to process what he was saying. "Wait, you're telling me there was a college fund? For both of us?" Grandma nodded, her face filled with concern. "Of course. We wanted to make sure both of you had the opportunity to get a good education without having to worry about the costs." My mind was racing. If those funds existed, where had all the money gone? And why hadn't my parents told me about this? Apparently, this was how my parents had been paying my college tuition all along. My grandparents were under the impression that both Vivy and I had been fully taken care of and said I simply needed to ask my parents for the money they'd set aside for me. I was stunned. I stared at them, trying to process what they were saying. Not once had my parents mentioned anything about a college fund, not to me, not to Vivy. For years, we believed they were paying for our education out of their own savings. My thoughts were a whirlwind of anger and confusion. Why hadn't they told us? Where had the money gone? What were they spending it on if not my education? The betrayal cut deep. All this time, they'd let me believe I might have to drop out of school or take on crippling loans, while there was a fund that could have covered everything. It didn't make any sense. Right there in my grandparents' living room, I pulled out my phone and called my mom. I put her on speaker so my grandparents could hear every word. I wasn't about to leave any room for misunderstanding. When she answered, I didn't bother with pleasantries. "Mom," I said firmly, "what's going on with the college fund Grandma and Grandpa gave you for me?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could tell she hadn't been expecting this. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her tone defensive. I didn't let up. "Grandma and Grandpa told me they gave you a college fund for both Vivy and me. So where is it?" Her hesitation was enough to confirm my suspicions. "Who told you this?" she finally asked, her voice tense. I didn't back down. Grandma and Grandpa did. I came to see them because I needed help paying for school. They told me there was already money set aside for me. Her tone shifted from defensive to angry. "You went to them for money? Without talking to me first? How could you do that?" At this point, my grandfather, who had been sitting quietly, stepped in. His voice was steady and firm as he said, "We gave you that money specifically for their college education, not for anything else. So where is it?" The line went silent for a moment. Then, my mom stammered, "It wasn't really a college fund just for them. It was money for the family, to use as needed." Grandpa's voice cut through her excuse like a knife. "No," he said sharply, "we made it very clear that money was to be used only for their college education. So I'll ask again, where is it?" My mom struggled to respond, then finally said she'd have to talk to my dad, who handled most of their finances. Her flustered and evasive tone only made things worse. She sounded like someone caught red-handed, trying desperately to cover their tracks. Not long after, she texted me, accusing me of going behind her back and being manipulative by involving my grandparents in this situation. She said I had no right to make her look bad in front of her own parents. But I wasn't going to let her guilt trip me. My grandparents and I decided to confront my parents in person. A few days later, we showed up at their house. Grandpa didn't waste time. As soon as we sat down, he demanded answers. Why are you refusing to pay for the rest of Alex's college when we gave you money specifically for that purpose?" he asked, his voice firm and unwavering. My dad tried to deflect, mumbling something about how the money hadn't been enough to cover everything. But Grandpa came prepared. He pulled out financial statements, proof of exactly how much they had saved for me. It was more than enough to cover 4 full years of tuition, with money left over. I couldn't hold back anymore. "Why didn't you ever tell me about this fund?" I asked, my voice shaking with frustration. "You let me believe I had to figure everything out on my own while you sat on this money. How could you let me stress out like that?" That's when my mom finally broke down. Her voice trembled as she admitted the truth. Over the years, they had slowly drained my college fund. She explained that a significant portion had gone toward helping Vivy. Every time Vivy failed a grade or struggled in school, my parents had dipped into my fund to pay for her private tutoring and repeat fees. I'd always thought they were making sacrifices out of their own savings to support her, but no, it was my future they'd been sacrificing. But that wasn't all. My mom confessed they'd also used the money to fund several family vacations over the years, trips I vaguely remembered, thinking at the time they were splurging from their own pockets. And to top it off, Vivy's new phone and the car she was currently driving? Both had been bought with my college fund. By the time she finished, my fund was completely depleted. The only reason I'd made it through the first 2 years of college was because of what was left before they spent the rest. Meanwhile, Vivy's college fund, which my grandparents had also given them, was untouched. I stared at them, unable to hide my disbelief. "Then it only seems fair," I said, my voice cold, "that you use Vivy's fund to pay for my last 2 years. You already spent my money on her, why shouldn't her fund cover me now?" At that point, my dad finally spoke up, trying to steer the conversation in his favor. He told me how I was the mature one, the unproblematic child who always found a way to handle things on my own. He said it was because of this that I shouldn't touch Vivy's college fund, warning that if I did, she might end up struggling too. He went on to explain how Vivy had always needed more help than I did, how she wasn't as independent or resilient as I was. He even tried to appeal to my sense of responsibility as her older sibling, saying I should be the bigger person and let her keep her fund untouched. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was as if he genuinely expected me to agree with their reasoning, as though my sacrifices were somehow justified because I was strong enough to handle the fallout of their selfish decisions. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. My grandparents were livid. My grandmother, who had been quiet for most of the confrontation, spoke up. Her voice was cold and unflinching as she said, "If you want, I'll help you sue them. What they did isn't just wrong, it's illegal. That money was meant for you, and they had no right to misuse it like this." My parents panicked. They scrambled to justify their actions, throwing out excuse after excuse about how they'd done what they thought was best for the family. But their words felt hollow, and it was clear no one in the room was buying it. My grandfather had heard enough. "You've crossed a line," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. He reminded them of how he had gifted them the family house years ago so they wouldn't have to worry about buying a home. He'd done it out of love and support, ensuring they could focus on raising their family without financial burdens. They'd never paid a cent in rent, and he'd never once threatened to take the house away. But now, after learning how selfishly they'd handled my college fund, using it not only on themselves but also on Vivy's high school fees, tutoring, car, and phone, he said he couldn't trust them anymore. "They need to learn a lesson," my grandfather declared. He told them he was going to transfer the deed of the house into my name. That way, I'd be the rightful owner. And if I wanted to, he added, I could kick them out entirely. Alternatively, they could stay, but only if they started paying me rent. That rent, he said, would cover the college expenses they'd forced me to shoulder on my own. My parents were stunned into silence. For the first time in this entire ordeal, the tables had turned. They were finally facing the consequences of years of selfishness and prioritizing themselves and Vivy at my expense. Ever since that day, they'd been pleading with my grandfather to reconsider. My dad even offered to sell Vivy's car and dip into his own savings to help pay for my college, but Grandpa hasn't budged an inch. Update 2 for everyone wondering where Vivy was during the confrontation, let me fill you in, she wasn't even home. She was off celebrating with her friends at a lake house, a trip she was paying for herself. Turns out, the getaway was a gift from my parents for finally managing to graduate high school. When I confronted my parents about it later, their response was almost comical. They said Vivy needed a break after all the stress of high school. Can you believe the audacity? Here I was, fighting tooth and nail just to secure the funds for my education, funds that should have already been covered by the college money my grandparents had saved for me, while they were more than happy to shell out for Vivy's luxury vacation. The double standard was infuriating. Update 3 now. For the happy news, my grandfather kept his word. The deed to the house has officially been transferred into my name. I'm the rightful owner now. The sense of empowerment is overwhelming. For so long, I felt powerless in the face of my parents' decisions. But now, the control is in my hands. Naturally, my parents are furious. They expected to live in the house without consequence, but those days are over. I gave them 2 options: they could move out within a month, or they could stay and start paying me rent next month. There's no room for negotiation. As for Vivy, she knows everything now. To be clear, she had no part in what my parents did. She didn't even know about the college fund or where the money for her schooling and luxuries had come from. When she found out the full extent of their actions, she was as furious as I was. To my surprise, Vivy has been incredibly supportive. She's angry with our parents for mishandling the funds and betraying not just me but also the trust our grandparents placed in them. It's comforting to know that, in the end, she's on my side. I'm so grateful to my grandparents for everything they've done. I don't know where I'd be without their support. They've been my rock through all of this, and I owe them more than I could ever express.